Postcolonial criticism. Perhaps one of the most important abilities critical theory develops in us is the ability to see connections where we didn't know they existed. For example, connections between our personal psychological conflicts and the way we interpret a poem, between the ideologies we've internalized and the literary work we found aesthetically pleasing, between a nation's political climates and what its intellectuals consider great literature, and so forth. Most of the critical theories we've studied so far have encouraged us to make connections along one or more of these lines. Post-colonial criticism is particularly effective at helping us see connections among all the domains of our experience: the psychological, ideological, social, political, intellectual, and aesthetic, in ways that show us just how inseparable these categories are in our lived experience of ourselves and our world. In addition, post-colonial theory offers us a framework for examining the similarities among all critical theories that deal with human oppression, such as Marxism, feminism, gay, lesbian, and queer theories, and African American theory. In fact, because post-colonial criticism defines formerly colonized peoples as any population that has been subjected to the political domination of another population, you may see post-colonial critics draw examples from the literary works of African Americans, as well as from, for example, the literature of Aboriginal Australians or the formerly colonized population of India. However, the tendency of post-colonial criticism to focus on global issues, on comparisons and contrast among various peoples, means that it is up to the individual members of specific populations to develop their own body of criticism on the history, traditions, and interpretation of their own literature. Of course, this is precisely what African American critics have been doing for some time, long before post-colonial criticism emerged as a powerful force in literary studies in the early 1990s. To place post-colonial criticism in a historical context of its own, however, let's take a minute and think back to our high school history classes. As most of us can recall from our high school education, European domination of the New World began in the late 15th century. Spain, France, England, Portugal, and Netherlands were the main contenders for the plunder of nature, natural and human resources, and over the next few centuries, European empires extended themselves around the globe. During the 19th century, Britain emerged as the largest imperial power, and by the turn of the 20th century, the British Empire ruled 1/4 of the Earth's surface, including India, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Ireland, and significant holding in Africa, the West Indies, South America, and the Middle East and Southeast Asia. British colonial domination continued until the end of the World War II. When India gained independence in 1947 and other colonies gradually followed suit, by 1980, Britain had lost all but a few of its colonial holdings. Although post-colonial criticism didn't become a major force in literary studies until the early 1990s, the cultural analysis of colonialism on which it draws has played an important role in anti-colonial political movements everywhere and took its place as a field of intellectual inquiry when colonial regimes began to topple after World War II. As a domain within literary studies, postcolonial criticism is both a subject matter and a theoretical framework. As a subject matter, postcolonial criticism analyzes literature produced by cultures that developed in response to colonial domination, from the first point of colonial contact to the present. You may recall reading postcolonial literature under the heading of Commonwealth literature, which it was called until the 1980s. Some of this literature was written by the colonizers. Much more of it was written and is being written by colonized and formerly colonized peoples. As a subject matter, any analysis of postcolonial literature work, regardless of the theoretical framework used, might be called postcolonial criticism. For English majors, of course, postcolonial criticism focuses on the literatures of cultures that developed in response to British colonial domination because English departments study, for the most part, literatures written in English. However, as a theoretical framework, and this is our primary concern here, postcolonial criticism seeks to understand the operations, politically, socially, culturally, and psychologically, of colonist and anti-colonist ideologies. For example, a good deal of postcolonial criticism analyzes the ideological forces that, on the one hand, pressed the colonized to internalize the colonizer's value, and on the other hand, promoted the resistance of colonized peoples against their oppressors, a resistance that is as old as colonialism itself. And as we will see, because colonialist and anti-colonialist ideologies can be present in any literary text, a work doesn't have to be categorized as a post-colonial for us to be able to use post-colonial criticism to analyze it. That so many peoples formerly colonized by Britain speak English, write in English, use English in their schools and universities, and conduct government business in English, in addition to the local languages they may use at home, is an indication of the residual effect of colonial domination on our cultures. In fact, the dynamic psychological and social interplay between what ex-colonial populations consider their native, indigenous, pre-colonial cultures and the British culture that was imposed on them constitutes a large portion of the field of study for post-colonial critics. For post-colonial cultures include both merger of antagonism between the culture of the colonized and that of the colonizer, which at this point in time are difficult to identify and separate into discrete entities. So complete was the British intrusion into government, education, cultural values, and daily lives of its colonial subjects. In short, although the colonizers retreated and left the lands they had invaded in the hands of those they have colonized, decolonization often has been confined largely to the removal of British military forces and government officers. What has been left behind is deeply embedded cultural colonization, the inculcation of British system of government and the education, British culture, and British values that denigrate the culture, morals, and even physical appearance of formerly subjugated peoples. Thus, Ex-colonials often were left with a psychological inheritance of a negative self-image and alienation from their own indigenous cultures, which had been forbidden or devalued for so long that much pre-colonial culture has been lost. Given that a good deal of post-colonial criticism addresses the problem of cultural identity as it is represented in post-colonial literature, let's take a closer look at the issue of post-colonial identity. In order to do so, however, we must first understand colonialist ideology, the reaction to which constitute the origin of post-colonial identity. Colonialist ideology often refers to as colonialist discourse to mark its relationship to the language in which colonialist thinking was expressed, was based on the colonizers' assumption of their own superiority, which they contrasted with alleged inferiority of native indigenous peoples, the original inhabitants of the land they invaded. The colonizer believed that only their own Anglo-European culture was civilized, sophisticated, or, as post-colonial critics put in, metropolitan. Therefore, native peoples were defined as savage, backward, undeveloped. Because their technology was more highly advanced, the colonizer believed that their whole culture was more highly advanced, and they ignored or swept aside the religion, customs, and codes of behavior of the peoples they subjugated. So the colonizers saw themselves at the center of the world. The colonized were at the margins. The colonizer saw themselves as the embodiment of what a human being should be, the proper self. Native peoples were considered other, different, and therefore inferior to the point of being less than fully human. This practice of judging all who are different as less than fully human are called othering, and it divides the world between us, the civilized, and them, the other, or savages. The savage is usually considered evil as well as inferior, the demonic other. But sometimes the savage is perceived as possessing a primitive beauty or nobility born of the closeness to nature, the exotic other. In either case, however, the savage remains the other and therefore not fully human. Eurocentrism. Today, this attitude, the use of European culture as the standard to which all other cultures are negatively contrasted, is called Eurocentrism. A common example of Eurocentrism in literary studies is the long-standing philosophy of so-called universalism. British, European, and later American culture standard-bearers judged all literature or terms of its universality to be considered great work. A literary text had to have universal characters and themes. However, whether or not a text characters and themes were considered universal depended on whether or not they resemble those from European literature. Thus, the assumption was that European ideas, and experience were universal. That is the standard of all humankind. An example of Eurocentric language can be seen in the terms first word, second word, third word, and fourth word to refer to, respectively. First, Britain, Europe, and the United States. Second, the right population of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Southern Africa, and for some theorists, the former Soviet bloc. Third, the technologically developing nations such as India, and those of Africa, Central and South America, and Southeast Asia. And fourth, the indigenous population subjugated by white settlers and governed today by the majority culture that surrounded them, such as Native Americans and Aboriginal Australians. And for some theorists, non-white population who have minority status in first world centuries, such as African Americans. Although these four words are commonly referred to today, we should be aware of their Eurocentric implications. Such a language makes sense only if history begins with Europe is organized in terms of European colonial conquest. It ignores the existence of earlier worlds such as those of Greece, Egypt, and Africa, and it privileges European military conquest as the primary means of organizing world history. Another example of Eurocentrism is a specific form of othering called Orientalism, analyzed by Edward Said, pronounced Sahid, which has been practiced in Europe, Britain, and America. Its purpose is to produce a positive national self-definition for Western nations by contrast with the Eastern nations on which the West projects all the negative characteristics it doesn't want to believe exist among its own people. Thus, the Chinese or the Arab or whatever Asian or Middle Eastern population is politically convenient are defined as a cruel, sneaky, evil, cunning, dishonest, given to sexual promiscuity and perversion, and the like. Think of the cruel, deceitful Arab merchant in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, published in 1818, who is saved from prison by the young De Lacy, a European, whom the Arab subsequently betrays. Citizens of the West then define themselves in contrast to the imaginary Oriental they were created as a kind, straightforward, good, upright, honest, and moral. In short, the Oriental is an invention of the West, by contrast to whom it has been able to define itself positively and justify any acts of military or economic aggression it has found advantageous. Thus, colonialist ideology, which is inherently Eurocentric, was a pervasive force in the British schools established in the colonies to inculcate British culture and values in the indigenous peoples, and thereby forestall rebellion. Difficult to rebel against a system or a people one has been programmed over several generations to consider superior. The plan was extremely successful and resulted in the creation of colonial subjects, colonized people who did not resist colonial subjugation because they were taught to believe in British superiority and therefore in their own inferiority. Many of these individuals try to imitate their colonizers as much as possible in dress, speech, behavior, and lifestyle. Postcolonial critics refer to this phenomenon as a mimicry, and it reflects both the desire of colonized individuals to be accepted by the colonizing culture and the shame experienced by colonized individuals concerning their own culture, which they were programmed to see as inferior. Postcolonial theories often describe the colonial subject as having a double consciousness or a double vision. In other words, a consciousness or way of perceiving the world that is divided between the two antagonistic cultures, that of the colonizer and that of the indigenous community. Double consciousness often produces an unstable sense of itself, which was heightened by the first migration realism frequently caused. For example, from the rural farm or village to the city in search of employment. Forced migration, either as a quest for employment, including indentured substitute, or as the result of enslavement, scattered large numbers of people around the globe, and large population of their descendants have remained in the diaspora or separated from their original homeland. This feeling of being caught between cultures, of belonging to neither rather than to both, of finding oneself arrested in psychological limbo, that result not merely from some individual psychological disorder, but from the trauma of the cultural displacement within which one lives, is referred to by Homi Bhabha and others as unhomeliness. Being unhomed is not the same as being homeless. To be unhomed is to feel not at home even in your own home because you are not at home in yourself. Your cultural identity crisis has made you a psychological refuge, so to speak. Double consciousness and unhomeliness persist in decolonized nations today. Among the tasks formerly colonized peoples face is the rejection of colonialist ideology, which define them as inferior, and reclamation of their pre-colonial past. Both tasks involve many complex problems of interest to postcolonial critics. For example, in order to reject colonialist ideology and embrace their pre-colonial cultures, some native authors, such as Kenya Wright, Ngugiwa Thiong'o, write in their own local languages. When they do so, however, they face the difficulty of surviving in a publishing industry, both in their own countries and internationally, that requires the use of English. The use of native languages often requires native writer to put forth the double effort of writing in their indigenous languages and then translating their work into English or having it translated. On the other hand, many indigenous writers from former British colonies prefer to write in English because that is the language in which they first learned to write. As Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe observes, "For me, there is no other choice. I have been given the language, I have intended to use it." Morning yet on Creation Day 62. Some also argue that English provides a common language for the various indigenous people within third and fourth world nations who speak a number of different local languages to communicate with one another. And they pointed out that the English, as a world language, facilitated an emergence of those nations into global politics and economics. Another problem that complicates the desire to reclaim a pre-colonial past is that it is not always easy to discover that the past. As we noticed earlier, much pre-colonial culture has been lost over many generations of colonial domination. In addition, many post-colonial theories argue that even had there been no colonization, the ancient culture would have changed by now. No culture stands still, frozen in time. Furthermore, most cultures are changed by cross-cultural contact, and often through military invasion. For example, ancient Celtic culture was changed by the Roman legions who occupied the British Isles and Anglo-Saxon cultures was changed by the many generations of French rule that followed Norman conquest of the same territory in the 11th century. By the same token, the pre-colonial cultures of colonized people influenced European culture. For example, Picasso's art was greatly influenced by his study of African masks. Therefore, many post-colonial theorists argue that post-colonial identity is necessarily a dynamic, constantly evolving hybrid of native and colonial cultures. Moreover, they assert that this hybridity or syncretism, as it is sometimes called, does not consist of stalemate between two warring cultures, but is a rather productive, exciting, positive force in a shrinking world that is itself becoming more and more culturally hybrid. This view encourages ex-colonials to embrace the multiple and often conflicting aspects of the blended culture that is theirs, and that is an indelible fact of history. It is important to note, however, that these arguments don't take into account the need of formerly colonized peoples to rediscover and affirm their pre-colonial civilization, for the very good reason that the colonizers told them they didn't have any pre-colonial civilizations. Before colonization, the colonizer claimed native people lived barbarically without any system of government, religion, or racial customs. Or if colonizers acknowledged that a native culture existed, they claimed that such a culture were not worth sustaining in the face of the superior civilization offered by the Europeans. Many ex-colonials therefore feel they must assert a native culture, both to avoiding being swamped by the Western culture so firmly planted on their soil, and to recuperate their national image in their own eyes and in the eyes of the others. This emphasis on indigenous culture, especially when accompanied by the attempt to eliminate Western influences, is called nativism or nationalism. From the native perspective, there is a big difference between a culture changing over time and a people being cut off from their culture. If you read Chapter 4, Feminist Criticism, you probably noted, as many post-colonial critics have, a number of similarities in the theoretical issues that concern feminist and post-colonial critics. For example, patriarchal subjugation of women is analogous to colonial subjugation of indigenous populations, and the resultant devaluation of women and colonized peoples poses very similar problems for both groups in terms of achieving an independent personal and group identity, gaining access to political power and economic opportunities, and finding ways to think, speak, and create that are not dominated by the ideology of the oppressor. These parallels between feminist and post-colonial concerns also underscore the double oppression suffered by post-colonial women, for they are the victims of both colonialist ideology, which devalues them because of their race and cultural ancestry, and patriarchal ideology, which devalues them because of their sex. Sadly, post-colonial women have suffered patriarchal oppression not only at the hands of colonialists, but within their own patriarchal cultures as well. As Anne McClintock observes, in a world where women do 2/3 of the world work, earn 10% of the world's income, and own less than 1% of the world property, The promise of post-colonialism, national independence, has been a history of hope postponed. And predictably, international aid to developing countries reinforces this pattern, giving the money, the machinery, and the trained men alone. Even in Africa, where women farmers produce 65 to 80% of all agricultural produce, yet do not own the land they work and are consistently bypassed by aid programs and development projects. As you may have noticed, our focus so far on the political, social, cultural, and psychological colonizations of indigenous peoples have limited our discussion to invader colonies. Colonies established among non-white peoples through the force of British arms, such as those established in India, Africa, the West Indies, South America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, for no one debates the inclusion of literature from these cultures in post-colonial literature studies. There is also general consensus that the United States and Ireland are not post-colonial nations. The first because it has been independent for so long and has itself colonized others. The second because it has long been an integral part of British culture. Though some Irish people, especially in Northern Ireland, would surely disagree with this assessment, and many post-colonial cities cite the work of Irish poets to be yet as emblematic of anti-colonist nationalism. However, there is much debate among post-colonial critics concerning whether or not the literature of white settler colonies, specifically those established in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, should be included in the study of post-colonial literature. Those who argue that the term post-colonial should be reserved for third and fourth world writers observe that white settler cultures share a tremendous common ground with Britain, including race, language, and culture. These colonies viewed Britain as the mother country, not as an imperial invader, and they were treated very differently from the non-white colonies Britain controlled. For example, white settler colonies were permitted a good deal of self-government and were granted dominion status, political autonomy within the British Commonwealth, without having to take up arms to achieve it. Indeed, it was white settlers who, as Britain did elsewhere, subjugated non-white indigenous peoples and took their land and nature's resources. In other words, these theories argue the inclusion of white settler cultures under the post-colonial rubric ignores the enormous difference race has played in the history of colonization and continues to play today in the racist attitude that keep third and fourth world peoples economically oppressed. On the other hand, theorists who believed white settler cultures should be included under the rubric post-colonial argue that the foundational concept of post-colonial criticism is anti-colonial resistance, and the literature of white settler cultures have a good deal to teach us about the complexity of anti-colonial resistance, because their own resistance to culture obliteration by an overwhelming British cultural presence, has occurred without the help of clear distinction between colonized and colonizer, a distinction that new white invader colonies have been able to count on. In other words, white colonial subjects experience in a subtle, less clearly marketed form the same double consciousness experienced by non-white colonial subjects. From this perspective, we can't simply ignore the anti-colonialist literature produced by the Second World, while as we uncritically assume that all the literature produced by non-white colonized people is necessarily a literature of resistance. Another debate engaging the attention of post-colonial critics concerns the politics of their own critical agenda. For example, the term post-colonial criticism implies that colonialism is a thing of the past. In reality, it's not. Colonialism is no longer practiced as it was between the late 15th and mid-20th centuries through the direct overt administration of governors and educators from the colonizing country. Today, through different means, the same kind of political, economic, and cultural subjugation of vulnerable nations occurs at the hands of international cooperation from such a world power as the United States, Germany, and Japan. Indeed, Japan has become so Americanized since the end of the World War II that it was considered Western power. This new colonialism, as it is called, exploits the cheap labor available in developing countries, often at the expense of those countries' own struggling business, cultural traditions, and ecological well-being. Neo-colonialist corporate enterprise is supported when the need arises by the perfect regimes, local rulers paid by corporations to support its interest, and by covert military intervention, sometimes in the form of financing troops loyal to corporate political interest, sometimes in the form of enlisting military aid from the Western power most closely aligned with the corporation's concerns. In the other words, just as in the case of old-style European colonialism, there is a big money to be made in this game, and the major players are too powerful to be bound by any rules of fair play. Cultural imperialism, a direct result of economic domination, consists of the takeover of one culture by another. The food, clothing, customs, recreation, and values of the economically dominant culture increasingly please those of the economically vulnerable culture until the latter appears to be kind of imitation of the former. American cultural imperialism has been one of the most pervasive forms of this phenomenon, as we see American fashions, movies, music, sports, fast food, and consumerism squeezes out indigenous culture traditions all over the world. Some theorists believe that post-colonial criticism is itself a form of cultural imperialism. For one thing, most post-colonial critics, including those born in formerly colonized nations, many of whom were educated at European universities and live abroad, all belong to an intellectual elite and academic ruling classes that has, it would seem, little in common with Puritans or people of inferior status. That is with the majority of poor, exploited ex-colonial peoples who are the object of their concern. Furthermore, post-colonial criticism's analysis of the problem of cultural identity specifically is focused on the stability and dynamic hybrid forms of cultural identity is largely a product of the post-structuralist deconstructive theory of the First World. As you may recall from Chapter 8, deconstruction defines the self as a fragmented pastiche of numerous selves within a world that has no stable meaning and no value beyond that which we assign it. Such a theory is extremely helpful in allowing us to understand how we construct the illusion of our own identity out of the ideological materials provided by all our culture. And the construction has been used effectively to reveal the centrism and cultural imperialism of the Western philosophy and literature that have been imposed on the rest of the world. However, it is understandable that nations struggle to define their cultural identity. Might not find this destabilizing the theory very attractive and might mistrust Western theories in general, having suffered Western dominations for so long. Finally, because postcolonial criticism can be used to interpret literature in the Western literary canon, some theorists are concerned that it will become just one more way to read the same first world authors we've been reading for years, rather than a method that brings to the fore the works of the third and fourth world writers as well as the works of those second world writers who address post-colonial issues. Happily, it seems unlikely that this fear will be realized, given the international success of such a post-colonial writers as Chinua Achebe, Nigeria, Salmon Rushdie, India, Jamaica Kincaid, Antigua, West Indies, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Kenya. The Nobel Prize for Literature was won by Olu Soyinka, Nigeria, in 1986, by Nadine Gordimer, South Africa, in 1991, by Derek Walcott, St. Lucia, West Indies, in 1992, by Toni Morrison, the United States, in 1993, and by J.M. Coetzee, South Africa, in 2003. As a citizen of the United States, Ms. Morrison is, of course, a member of the First World. I include her in this list, however, because some post-colonial thinkers consider her as an African American, a member of the Fourth World. In addition, there has been a rapid increase in the number of colleges offering post-colonial or Third World literature courses. Nevertheless, it's not unreasonable to be apprehensive that post-colonial literature will be colonized, that is, interpreted according to the European norms and standards by the cultural ecocentrism and that dominates literary education and literary criticism the world over. Post-colonial criticism and literature. Wherever post-colonial critics place themselves in terms of these debates, however, most interpret post-colonial literature in terms of a number of overlapping topics. These include, among others, the following common topics. First, native peoples' initial encounter with the colonizers and the disruption of indigenous culture. Second, the journey of the European outsider through one unfamiliar wilderness with a native guide. 3. Othering the colonizers' treatment of members of the indigenous culture as less than fully human and colonial oppression in all its forms. Fourth, mimicry, the attempts of the colonized to be accepted by imitating the dress, behavior, speech, and lifestyle of the colonizers. Fifth, exile, the experience of being an outsider in one's own land or a foreign wanderer in Britain. 6. Post-independence, exuberance followed by disillusionment. The struggle for individual and collective cultural identity and the related themes of alienation, unhomeliness, feeling that one has no cultural home or sense of cultural belonging, the double consciousness, feeling torn between the social and the psychological demands of two antagonistic cultures, and hybridity, experiencing one's cultural identity as a hybrid of two or more cultures, which feeling is sometimes described as a positive alternative to unformedness. Eighth, the need for continuity with pre-colonial past and self-definition of the political future. These common topics illustrate post-colonial criticism's recognition of the close relationship between psychology and ideology, or more specifically between individual identity and cultural beliefs. In addition, most post-colonial critics analyze the ways in which a literary text, whatever its topics, is colonialist or anti-colonialist. That is the ways in which the text reinforces or resists colonialism's oppressive ideology. For example, in the simplest terms, a text can reinforce colonialist ideology through positive portrayals of the colonizers, negative portrayals of the colonized, or uncritical representation of the benefit of colonialism for the colonized. Analogously, text can resist colonialist ideology by depicting the misdeeds of the colonizers, the suffering of the colonized, or the detrimental effects of colonialism on the colonized. Such analysis is not always as straightforward as this simple outline might lead you to expect. However, for the ideological content of literary text is rarely able to confine itself to such tidy categories. Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, 1902, for example, is extremely anti-colonist in its negative representation of the colonial enterprise. The Europeans conducting the ivory trade in the Congo are portrayed as harlots, greedy thieves who virtually enslaves the indigenous population to help collect and transport Europeans' loot, and the negative effects of the European presence. Native peoples are graphically depicted. However, as Chinua Achebe observes, the novel's condemnation of European is based on a definition of Africans as savages. Beneath their veneer of civilization, the Europeans are, the novel tells us, as barbaric as the Africans. And indeed, Achebe notes, the novel portrays Africans as a prehistoric mass of frenzied, howling, incomprehensible barbarians. Africa is a setting and backdrop which eliminates the African as a human factor. Africa is a symbolic battlefield devoid of all recognizable humanity, into which the wandering European enters at his peril. An image of Africa 12. In other words, despite the Heart of Darkness' anti-colonialist agenda, the novel points to the colonized population as the standard of savagery to which Europeans are compared. Thus, Achebe uncovers the novel's colonialist subtext of which the text does not seem to be aware. Let's look at a few more brief examples of post-colonial interpretations of literary text. Homi Bahab gave us a wonderful example of the global orientation of much post-colonial criticism when he offers a new way to analyze the world literature, not in terms of national traditions, which is how it generally has been studied, but in terms of post-colonial topics that cut cross national boundaries. For example, Bahab suggests that world literature might be studied in terms of the different ways cultures have experienced historical trauma, perhaps such a trauma as slavery, revolution, civil war, political mass murder, repressive military regimes, the loss of cultural identity, and the like. Or world literature might be seen as the study of the ways in which cultures define themselves positively by othering groups whom they demonized or otherwise devalue for their purpose. Or we might analyze the world literature by examining the representations of people and events that occur across cultural boundaries rather than within them, such as representations of migrants, political refugees, and colonized peoples. The center of such a study, Bahab says, would neither be the sovereignty of national cultures nor the universalism of human culture, but a focus on the unspoken, unrepresented pasts that haunt the historical present. That is, we might study what would literature tells us about the personal experience of people whom history has ignored. The disfranchised, the marginalized, the unhomed, such as are found in the work of South African writer Nathan Goldheimer and African American writer Toni Morrison. For example, Bahab argues that Goldheimer's My Son's Story 1990 and Morrison's Beloved 1987 are homely novels in which the female protagonists, Ayla and Sadat, respectively, live in the hinterland between cultures. Ayla is unhomed because she is imprisoned for using her house as a cover for gun running in an effort to resist South Africa's racist government. Seda because she has killed her baby daughter in order to save the child from the abuses of a cruel slave master. Thus, Bahada observes these two characters are doubly marginalized. First, as women of color living in racist society. Second, as women whose actions have placed them outside the circle of their own communities. In representing the psychological and historical complexities of these characters' ethical choices, both novels reveal the ways in which historical reality is not something that happens just on the battlefield or in the government office. Rather, historical reality comes into our homes and affects our personal lives in the deepest possible ways. Marginalized people may be more aware of this fact because it is pressed on them by violence and oppression, but it is true for everyone. Another attempt to find a common denominator in post-colonial literature is made by Helen Tiffin, who claims that the subversive anti-colonialist many-verse characteristic of post-colonial text does not lie in the construction or reconstruction of national cultural identity, but rather in the rereading and rewriting of the European historical and fictional record. Tiffin argues that as it is impossible to retrieve a pre-colonial past or construct a new cultural identity completely free of the colonial past, most post-colonial literature has attempted instead to investigate the means by which Europe imposed and maintained colonial domination of so much of the rest of the world. One of the many ways post-colonial literature accomplishes this task, Tiffin maintains, is through the use of what she calls canonical counter-discourse, a strategy whereby a post-colonial writer takes up a character or characters or the basic assumptions of a British colonial text and unveils its colonialist assumptions, subverting the text for post-colonial purposes. Tiffin sees this kind of literary revolution 97 in, for example, Why the Sargasso Sea, Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre, writes back 98 to Bronte's novel by, among other things, reinterpreting Bertha Mason, Rochester's West Indian wife. Bronte's novel portrays Bertha, the descendants of white colonial settlers, as an insane, drunken, violent, and lascivious woman who tricked Rochester into marriage and whom her husband must keep locked in the attic for her own and everyone else's protection. In contrast, Lee's novel depicts Bertha in Beatrice Spivak's words as a critique of imperialism. Spivak 271, a sane woman driven to violent behavior by Rochester's imperialist oppression. This narrative thereby unmasks the colonialist ideology informing Bronte's narrative, and part of Jane Eyre's colonialist ideology, we might add, is revealed when the novel associates Marthas with a non-white native population as seen through the eyes of colonialist Europe. Martha's face is a black and scarlet visage. Bronte 93, CHs 27, Volume 2, Colonialist Europe. Bertha's face is a black and scarlet visage, and the room she inhabits is a wild beast den. In other words, according to the colonialist discourse in which Jane Eyre participates, to be insane, drunken, violent, and lascivious is the equivalent of being non-white. Tiffin notes that similar canonical counter-discourse can be found, for example, in Fall 1988 by South African writer J.B. Coetzee, in the way the novel reveals the colonialist ideology of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, 1719, an ideology manifest in Crusoe's colonialist attitude toward the land on which he is shipwrecked and toward the black man he colonizes and named Friday. And of course, canonical counter-discourse occurs in the numerous modern Caribbean and South American performance of Shakespeare's The Tempest, 1611, which reveals the political and psychological operation of prosperous colonialist subjugation of Caribbean in the original play. As Tiffin observes, canonical counter-discourse doesn't unmask merely the literary works, to which it responds, but the whole fabric of the colonialist discourse in which those works participate. Finally, Edward said, demonstrates how post-colonial criticism of canonized literary work often involves among the margins of the work, for example, minor characters, and for a geographical location to the center of our attention. This is what he does in his analysis of Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, 1814. The entire novel is set in England around the turn of the 19th century, most of it on the sizable estate of the wealthy Sir Thomas Bertram, who epitomizes the positive images of the traditional English gentleman of property. He is well-bred, rational, honorable, and highly moral, and is the proper patriarchal head of his home and of the overseas agricultural enterprise that financially sustained at home. This enterprise is in Antigua, in the Caribbean British colonies, and it is maintained by slave labor. But things are not going well in Antigua, and Sir Thomas must travel there to take control personally, and take control he does apparently with the same efficiency with which he rules his home. For having said his colonial garden, culture, and imperialism at its 6, in order, as Seth put it, Sir Thomas returns home to quickly set to right his household, which, without his paternal guidance, has gotten out of the order. His grown children have fought among themselves, engaged in clandestine courtships, and generally created a domestic uproar. Thus, among other things, Seth knows that the novel draws a strong parallels between domestic and international authority, culture, and imperialism 97. For the financial well-being of the British estate depends on the success of the colonial enterprise, and the orderly operation of both depends on the guidance of the British patriarch. Although Sir Thomas stripped Antigua is peripheral to the narrations, it is mentioned only in passing, and we see nothing that goes on there. It is absolutely crucial to the action. Culture Imperial 87. In Seth's words, Mansfield Park is the part of the structure of Britain's expanding imperialist venture, and we can sense how ideas about independent races and terrorists were held not only by foreign office executives, colonial bureaucrats, and military strategists, but also by intelligent novel readers educating themselves in the fine points of moral evaluation, literary balance, and stylistic finish. Culture and Imperialism 95. In other words, the colonialist ideology contained in literature is deposited there by writers and observed by readers without their necessarily realizing it. Some questions post-colonial critics ask about literary text. The questions that follow are offered to summarize post-colonial approaches to literature. Keep in mind that most post-colonial analysis, regardless of the issues on which they focus, will include some attention to whether the text is colonialist, anti-colonialist, or some combination of the two that is ideologically conflicted. 1. How does the literary text explicitly or allegorically represent various aspects of colonial oppression? Special attention is often given to those areas where political and cultural oppression overlapped. as it does, for example, in the colonizers' control of language, communication, and knowledge in colonized countries. Second, what does the text reveal about the problematics of postcolonial identity, including the relationship between personal and cultural identity, and such issues as a double consciousness and hybridity? 3. What does the text reveal about the politics and or psychology of anti-colonialist resistance? For example, what does the text suggest about ideological, political, social, economic, or psychological forces that promote or inhibit resistance? How does the text suggest that resistance can be achieved and sustained by an individual or group? Fourth, what does the text reveal about the operations of cultural difference, the ways in which race, religion, class, gender, sexual orientation, cultural beliefs, and customs combine to form individual identity in shaping our perceptions of ourselves, others, and the world in which we live? Othering might be one area of analysis here. 5. How does the text respond to or comment on the characters, topics, or assumptions of canonized, colonized work? Following Helen Tiffin's lead, examine how the post-colonial text reshapes our previous interpretations of canonical text. 6. Are there meaningful similarities among the literatures of different post-colonial populations? One might compare, for example, the literature of native peoples from different countries whose land was invaded by colonizers, the literature of the white settlers colonized in different countries, or the literature of different populations in the African diaspora. Or one might compare literature works from all three of these categories in order to investigate. For example, if the experience of colonization creates some common elements of the cultural identity that outweigh differences in race and nationality. 7th, how does a literary text in the Western canon reinforce or undermine colonialist ideology through its representation of colonization and or its inappropriate silence about colonized people? Does the text teach us anything about the colonialist or anti-colonialist ideology through its illustration of any of the post-colonial concepts we've discussed? A text does not have to treat the subject of colonization in order to do this. Depending on the literary work in question, we might ask one or any combination of these questions, or we might come up with a useful question that's listed here. These are just some starting points to get us thinking productively about literature from a post-colonial perspective. Keep in mind that not all post-colonial critics will interpret the same text in the same way, even if they focus on the same post-colonial concepts. As in every field, even expert practitioners disagree. Whatever ways we may choose to apply post-colonial criticism, our goal in using this approach is to learn to see some important aspects of literature that we might not have seen so clearly or so deeply without this theoretical perspective, to appreciate the opportunities and the responsibilities of living in culturally diverse world, and to understand that culture is not just a fixed collection of artifacts and customs frozen in time, but a way of relating to oneself and to the world, a psychological and social frame of reference that necessarily alters in response to cross-cultural encounters, whether those encounters occur in our community or on the page of a literary text. The following reading of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby is offered as an example of what a postcolonial interpretation of the novel might yield. You will notice that my postcolonial reading relies a good deal on psychological analysis and is similar in some ways to my discussion of the novel in Chapter 3, Marxist Criticism. In addition, my postcolonial interpretation includes both an analysis of the novel's three minor black characters and its erasure of the African American presence in Jazz Age New York City, and an analysis you will also find as a part of my African American reading of the novel in Chapter 11. This kind of theoretical overlaps is quite common for a postcolonial interpretation because postcolonial criticism draws on these three theories, among others, in its attempts to analyze all aspects of colonialist and anti-colonialist ideologies. In short, my postcolonial interpretation of Fitzgerald's novel focuses on what I will argue is the worst colonialist ideology, an ideology that can subjugate minority populations within a nation's borders, as well as colonized populations, as here on the globes. Indeed, as I will argue, the novel illustrates some of the ways in which colonialist ideology is also a psychological state, not just a way of thinking, but a way of being that is detrimental to those who oppress others as well as to those who are oppressed.